Good deal. I've got 5:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. For those that don't know me, my name is Alan Pugh. I'm the staff engineer here at the City of Fayetteville. I'm also our floodplain administrator, and one of our duties is to basically administer all the development and other things that go on in the floodplain. So I know I've spoken to some of you. I appreciate you coming out tonight to talk about a very serious issue out on Hamstring Creek. We've got Whit Montague with Arkansas Department of Natural Resources here. And she's going to go over some funding options for upcoming grant opportunities for us. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to her.
So if you can pull up the presentation. So I asked them to pull up a presentation, but this is really a conversation, okay? So feel free to ask questions, except for the people online. If they could put their questions in the chat box, and every once in a while I'll ask Jack if he can, I'll ask if there are any questions there. But here in the audience, please feel free to ask questions. Also, if I start using government speak or engineering speak or anything like that, stop me, because I can get really nerdy when I'm talking, and that's not very conducive to a conversation, which is what we're going to have. So I'm Whit Montague. I am the supervisor for dam safety and floodplain management for the state of Arkansas. I'm with the Arkansas Natural Resources Division, which is a division of the Department of Ag. And what I want to talk to you about today is one of the programs that I oversee, which is Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. But I'm not just going to talk about that program. I'm also going to talk about two other programs which provide similar support, but they are administered by ADAM, the Arkansas Division of Emergency Management. Since they're very similar, since timelines are similar, it makes sense to talk about them at the same time. So let's talk about flood mitigation. Let's talk about options and review. Let's talk about what mitigation is. Mitigation is, well, in my opinion, mitigation is both reactive and proactive. It's reactive because you have incurred damage. You have been flooded. So you need some support. You need some help. You need assistance. So we're coming in and we're helping you recover from the damage that has been done. But it's proactive because in the best of all worlds, it's also reducing future flood risk. It's either keeping you out of the way of harm from the flooding, or it's reducing the likelihood of a flood. Slide, please. So let's talk about the existing problems that I see all the time that people are asking about. This is happening in my yard. This is happening on my property. Are there opportunities to address these problems? So we see standing water in yards, in neighborhoods. That's one of the things. Next, please. And this might look familiar. This is from very recent. We see almost a flash flood type of effect where the water's coming up fairly rapidly because of intense rainfall, and it's in your streets, it's in your yards, it's causing very dangerous situations. Next, please. And it's not only the danger to you, it's impacting your infrastructure. If the water keeps impacting the roadways, if it's flowing through the bridges, it's scouring the supports. It's not only you that's being harmed, it's not only your home, but it's the businesses, it's the infrastructure. So these are very long-term impacts, which goes back to me saying mitigation isn't just to repair, it's to reduce and mitigate for the future. Next slide. So even if we don't see these big, flashy, dare you say, sexy floods that, not dinging the newspaper, but, news loves to see lots of water standing. It makes good pictures. But even if it's that frequent little floods, what we like to call the wet socks flood events, where it's really not enough water that it might be going in your house and causing a lot of damage inside, but if you went outside, your socks would get wet, that type of flooding. And so it's sitting on top of the foundation, it's sitting in your soil, and so you can see foundation shift, you can see settlement cracks appear in your walls. So it's not only those big flashy floods, it's just the ongoing intrusion of water onto your property. Next. So I talked about the existing problems I often see. What do you all see? Do you see other problems? Are there other things with flooding that you see? Water in the home. Mm-hmm. So we're water in the home, water obstructing access in the streets. Water in the home is definitely a significant problem. Not only we're talking about the structural damage, but we can have long-term health issues from mold that grows in there. So yes, these are things that we would like to address. So what I'm going to talk about is our opportunities to address it using funding from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration. I work with them through the National Flood Insurance Program. The National Flood Insurance Program is what I like to call a handshake agreement between the federal government and local jurisdictions, either towns and or counties. And so what the agreement says that in exchange for the local community working to reduce flood risk to the people who are building, to the existing structures, to the new structures that are going in return for them doing that, FEMA will provide you access to relatively low cost flood insurance, and they will also grant you access to mitigation funding that we're going to talk about. So it's a handshake agreement, and Fayetteville is like a high flyer in Arkansas because they're also part of the community rating system, and that is a recognition by FEMA that they're going above and beyond what most of the nation is doing, and because of that, that leads to a discount for those people who have national flood insurance policies. So that's a, that's a great thing, and I love being here in Fayetteville because of that. Mitigation, when we're going to look at things, we might see, now this is a neighborhood in Northwest Arkansas, and when we're just looking at it on Google Earth, it looks like a great, it looks like an attractive neighborhood, close to the highway, nice wide spaces. Yeah, it looks great. Next slide. But when I look at the flood risk mapping, I see that maybe things aren't so great. This is an analysis of flood risk from what we sometimes call the 100-year event. And so where the red is bad, it's deeper, it's a heat map, if you will. So the red is where we would see the deepest water under flood conditions, with the light blue being a little more shallow. But you're seeing that we're getting floods. And let's take a time to talk about 100-year event. Now, I don't like to use a 100-year, because if I tell you the 100-year flood, you're already mad, because how many times have you flooded in the, and it's like, that's more than once every 100 years, right? So, but it's really coming from the 1% chance event. So every event has a 1% chance of causing this flood. If I'm a betting woman, I like 1%, right? What I really like to think of it is your son Bobby's flood. And let me tell you why. Anybody here have children? Okay, you have children. You have teenagers, older kids, adults. Okay, now you hope that when you have a kid, you hope that when they're 18, they're gone. They've packed up their stuff, they're out. But in reality, it takes till about they're 30. And in that 30 years, if you are in an official map flood zone, you have more than a 25% chance of experiencing a significant flood. So instead of thinking about it as a 100-year event, think about it as Bobby's event. Or if you have a mortgage, think about that typical 30-year mortgage. You have more than a 25% chance of experiencing a significant flood. All right? That's what these people are experiencing. So I'm going to talk to you about the FMA program. The FMA program, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, is the specific program that is at Arkansas Natural Resources Division. Right? It provides grants to help with planning as well as performing flood mitigation projects. In the last fiscal year, we don't know what's coming up in the in the upcoming year. But in the last fiscal year, nationally, they had $160 million in grants available. 10 millions were for what we call project scoping. If we're going to have some huge event, like we're going to do a big big lake to control flood waters, or if we're going to do stream bank restoration and increase the storage capability of the floodplain so that can hold more water so we're not getting fast, deep water going downstream. Or if we're going to create wetlands to help slow and clean the flood waters. That's all big projects, but they need to be scoped first. You can't just say, hey, I'm going to execute this right away. I want some support so I can really think about this in a thoughtful and effective way. So $10 million was for that. $70 million was allocated to actually implement the project. So some of those people already scoped them, and so they were ready to implement them. So that's what the other $70 million was for. And then finally, the $80 million, some technical assistance from FEMA and the state, building your program better so you can address flood proactively. Flood hazard mitigation planning. These are opportunities where you can plan. Maybe we need to get a cohesive plan, emergency management, public works, planning council all together so we can plan this. And then finally, what I'm really going to focus on and what you're probably most interested in are the individual flood mitigation projects. So before we go there, do we have any questions? Jack, any questions in the chat box? Oh, no. Okay, so when we talk about the individual projects, we typically talk about FRED, all right? You'll hear us say FRED. So the FRED, the F in FRED stands for flood proofing. So flood proofing is typically used on non-residential structures. It's literally building a wall, a flood wall, to keep the flood waters out. So you would manually lift this, put this in effect when the flood waters are coming. Or it is elevating your outside utilities, such as your HVAC units, so that they are above the floodwater and that you are not losing these every time it floods. So also putting in flood vents. Those are vents in your foundation that allow the flood waters to pass through, and this is through a crawl space, obviously, not on slab on grade, but through a crawl space or something like that. Because water, if you think about it, when it's really flowing fast, and if it's a deep flood, it can literally push your house off of its support. And the flood vents address that issue. So the next thing is R for relocation. Now, I want to do this. Alan knows I really want to do this, but we have never done a relocation in the state of Arkansas. I'd love to do it. They do it in Louisiana all the time. So it is literally, you dig up the structure and you move it out of the floodplain, okay? So we see this most often with historic buildings. They want to maintain the structure. They don't want to modify it to flood proof it. They don't want to elevate it. They just want it somewhere where it's safe from the flood water. So that's what we see. So that's what the R is. The E is for elevation. You elevate the home. You bring it off the ground so that it is above the predicted flood elevation. So this is an example. This picture is from Arkansas. The home on the top and bottom, it's the same home. They obviously took an opportunity to redecorate the outside also. But the home was on about one block, and it was getting repetitively flooded. And so they decided to do an elevation project. So they came in, they literally lifted it up so that the floodwaters would pass underneath, and they secured it so that it wouldn't, the floodwaters wouldn't cause that support to crumple. So, and next one. And finally, and this, it sounds bad, it's demolition, demolition, but it's really acquisition and demolition. So what it is that the state, in conjunction with FEMA, will pay you for your home. We will buy your home from you, so we will acquire it, and then we will demolish it. And when we demolish it, the remaining area is graded, it's whatever needs to be done, it is open space. And that open space use, it's dedicated open space. It's not going to be sold down the, in 2 or 3 decades for commercial development or anything like that. It's dedicated open space. So we have seen it used for community gardens. We've seen it used for nature trails. When they're next to schools, sometimes it's an expansion for the schools. We see them using it as a nature lab, if you will, an outdoor lab, rain gardens and things such as that. So you use it that way, and it's dedicated open space. And you get to take your money and go buy a house somewhere else away from the flood waters. So that's your FRED, flood proofing, relocation, elevation, and demolition. Any questions? Well, no, let's talk about that. So there are 2 pricing systems. So if you were recently damaged, and this is, let's say it was a 2017 event. If you remember you have very significant damage. So 2017 event, and you said, okay, I'm not moving back into that house, I'm done. So we can do a post-event pricing. So we post-event price at what the market value is, and you get to keep any insurance money that you received. We're not going to deduct that. So even if you didn't rebuild, didn't repair, it's going to make you whole because you'll have the money that you receive from your insurance, flood insurance payout, plus the money for the acquisition. Or it could be pre-event. If it's pre-event, then if you did receive flood insurance payout, we would deduct it. So it's, you just have to decide which one you want. And it also, if you're not doing it immediately after event, we typically do pre-event pricing. So, yes?
When considering acquiring the properties for demolition,
Mm-hmm.
they have to be in the repetitive loss area, or through engineering, could you show that taking these properties, upstream of that repetitive loss area would mitigate those flood waters and make that a safe space, like geographically constrained where that can take place.
So I'm going to come back around to your question. So the first thing is, I'm starting by talking about the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, my program. We house the National Flood Insurance Program for the state of Arkansas. So anything I buy out, anything I'm involved with, either the homeowner has an NFIP flood policy or the community that will be improved has a high percentage of NFIP policyholders. But there is a sister program, BRIC, that does not require that flood insurance buyout. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there's a benefit cost analysis that FEMA has applicants complete, that the applicant must complete. So that is really more the driving force. You don't have to be in the floodplain. You don't have to be severely or repetitively flooded, but it's probable that your BCA, your benefit cost analysis, won't reach the point that FEMA will think it's worthwhile. Severe repetitive loss, you've experienced flooding a significant number of times. And it's from FEMA's standpoint, they are looking at it, they only apply those terms to people who have NFIP policies. Now, you can document, if you're looking at the other programs, you can say, I've experienced all this flooding, no, I don't have flood insurance, but you're making your case, all right? So yes, it does count because you have to show the benefit cost analysis. And if it's not whatever their set BCA is for that year, that will make the difference. And the closer or the higher you are on that BCA, the better the chance that FEMA will select you. Does that answer your question?
Well, I'm more just thinking of, instead of demolishing the property and then suffering losses, if you're able to reduce non-permeable surfaces upstream so that by
So that's a different project, though. If that, I would say, I would posit that as a community mitigation project, that I am going to create upstream storage to protect downstream homes. Does that, okay. Next, please. And then that leads us directly, yes. On the 17th one, mm-hmm. 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 Right. So this time I didn't have quite the same damage. Right. But I still had water in my garage and water on mm-hmm. But it seems like there ought to be a way to stop water, so because these other projects seem like it's so expensive to move your house or lift your house way up. That in my case, because I'm an older person, mm-hmm. Retired, but it really seems to my advantage to do that. So it would be nice if we could stop the water, but unfortunately the trend has been, doesn't mean it will always be, but the trend has been that we're seeing increasing development in the watershed, which is reducing the permeable landscape, the landscape that allows water to naturally enter the groundwater system into the stream system. So we're seeing more runoff that is converting into flood water. And we're also seeing more frequent and more intense precipitation events. And so it's very difficult. That's one of the things we're looking for is resilience. And given what we're seeing, the trends we're seeing, it's difficult to prevent waters from entering an individual home. But going back to community mitigation projects, you can possibly take those floodwaters offline, redirect them to a community retention, detention facilities, things such as that, so that they're not entering a neighborhood.
Yes. Can I address that a little bit too? Specific to your area, what the city has done previously is we hired a local engineer to do a flood study for the entirety of the Hamstring Basin. After that study was complete, we reviewed multiple options, providing detention upstream, increasing the size of channels, which with Corps of Engineers permits and other things may not be feasible anyway, but we wanted to have the answer to that question. So, significantly increasing channels, providing upstream detention. We just weren't able to move the needle far enough to be able to protect this area from flooding. So the second step to that was, what are our other options? That's why we kind of reached out to the Natural Resources Division to say what funding is out there and what are the options for that funding. And specifically started talking about potential for elevation projects. It would still flood around your homes in those instances, but it would not flood inside your home. So still have potential issues with vehicles and everything you had outside, but not the issue that you're dealing with today with water inside the home itself. So I'm not saying those engineering solutions are off the table. We've just not found a feasible one to date to be able to comfortably say we could protect that area.
When you mentioned that those solutions weren't feasible, do you mean that they were like the resources mean that they were not feasible, like the funding was not present to make it, or that even if you had the funding to do those, there's just too much water, too much,
It was the latter. The ones that we researched, I'll give you, for instance, we looked at increasing the channel next to Porter Road to maybe a 30 or 40 foot wide channel. It just was not bringing those elevations down very much. We looked at increasing the culvert size underneath Valley Drive with that project. We've looked at going all the way upstream to Lewis Park and providing detention there on some recently purchased property that the city controls. We looked at going on the other side of Weddington, the upstream side of Weddington, and potentially purchasing some property up there and building some detention basins. It's just the amount of water that we're dealing with. Even when we started combining those, we did not feel comfortable was going to be able to come in here and say that's going to keep you from flooding again. So that's kind of what led us the direction to talk to Whit and her group to say, what options do we have to mitigate these properties, at this location. And we did not even really, to answer your original question, get into costing out a lot of those, simply because we weren't finding them to be successful in the end goal.
You said the trend is more infill in the watershed.
Yes.
Does that affect which of the 4 options are chosen for individual projects?
Does that impact what?
Or how do you decide which project is best for the individual?
So
If it's a known problem and the infill can go full steam ahead, is that a decision? Or
it's more, we give you the options,
okay.
and we let it's a partnership, if you will, between the community and the property owner.
Okay.
So they see what's feasible, and we'll talk about why it must be between the community and the homeowner in just a minute.
So like
Mm-hmm.
we live next door,
Mm-hmm.
and I decided to sell my property back,
Mm-hmm.
and she decided not to.
Mm-hmm.
Would that make a difference? We all have to decide our fate.
Great question. No, you do not have to all decide the same thing. You don't, okay? Now, does it make it look more attractive to FEMA possibly if a significant number of people in a neighborhood decide to mitigate? Yes. They don't have to take the same mitigation option. How much that changes the needle on it, I don't know right now, because we haven't seen their priorities yet. They haven't released that yet. Right.
I'll just comment on that too from a city perspective. So, if we focus in on 2 options potentially, and that's not to say these are the only options on the table, so don't get me wrong, but if it's a question ultimately of elevation versus purchase, as the city's stands, we would look at, obviously we have to perpetually maintain that property if we do decide to purchase it from you. So I don't know what that looks like from an administrative or a city council standpoint at the end of the day, but I don't know that it would be extremely attractive for us to, purchase one-off lots here and there and then have to mow those and maintain those in perpetuity. So not to say we're going to force you in one direction or the other, so don't get me wrong, but there is some decision making, I think, on the local level that's going to have to be made once we have those discussions. So don't know if that confuses or helps, but that's just the city's perspective. So,
and it's something that FEMA has the history of what happens when you have, sometimes when you have those loan acquisitions. Sometimes, we have examples where it works because that loan acquisition becomes a community garden, but sometimes it's like, oh, open space, house, open space, duck, goose type of thing. So also, if you pick elevation, the great thing about elevation, if a number of people pick elevation, it brings down the cost. Because if they're in a neighborhood doing elevations, it is much less costly to everyone involved to have the contractor in there and doing the elevations than to have them do 1 or 2 elevations. That's just, yes. Mm-hmm.
Parking lot there, did they put in pool areas to collect the water that comes off there?
I'm going to give that to Alan.
I got 3 feet of water in front of my building and 2 feet in the back, which blew out my AC. And this is worse than 5 years ago. But it's like that huge parking lot there. Where's all that water go? It comes down to me. And the water from the creek next door, I guess it's a creek, I don't know if it's a creek or a river, but it floods over and it comes over to me. It pushed in my garage door. Is there anything, can I just put up a barrier right there to keep that water from coming out of the creek at me?
What I might like to do is on part of your question, have a conversation with you after the meeting, if you don't mind, to talk about your specific situation. With regard to Cross Church and Fitness One, it's kind of a long story, and I won't get into all of it, but I'm happy to talk about it in much detail as you would like. But there was an approved drainage plan for that entire development. in order to originally be developed. And I think that drainage plan dated back to the mid-2000s. And up until last year, basically the city by ordinance was required to honor that previously approved drainage plan. So short answer to your question is no, they did not put detention. There are reasons for that. They did an engineering analysis indicating that they didn't need it, and we can talk about the details of that offline if you would like. But know that based on last year, the city council approved an ordinance or regulation that indicates we're no longer required as a staff to honor those drainage reports if we have known flooding issues downstream, and in this case, we certainly do. So.
Can they do something about that now?
That, I don't know the answer to that question. As far as making a developer go back and do something would be very difficult in my opinion, just because they were abiding by the regulations when they developed. But certainly that's why we're here today talking about options that the city could take.
So that would be a possibility as an option to do something.
Well, they're
maybe not on their property, but you know, maybe downstream there's still a lot of open. There's a big field right next to them.
Mm-hmm. We did look at an option to provide detention up there on a certain situated on a certain piece of property that we don't control yet. We would have to offer to purchase that and do some things. I think that's where this community mitigation discussion comes into play, where FEMA does have funding that may be available to do that. If we could show from an engineering standpoint, it's going to help the issues downstream. So.
I also looked at the creek on Porter. They go along Porter Road, Whittington Porter, and the culvert there where it goes under the road, it's you know, it needs to be cleaned out again. Probably the whole creek there needs to get cleaned out.
And we can talk. It's a little bit of an issue because those are controlled by RDOT, the Arkansas Department of Transportation, because Weddington is a state highway. But the culvert itself, if they were to clean the culvert, that would fall to the state. But certainly we could have that conversation with them. I believe we've had a similar conversation with the culvert that passes by West End. I would have to look and see. I don't recall off the top of my head if it's in a drainage easement. If it's in a drainage easement, the city of Fayetteville Transportation Division would be responsible for that. But I'd have to look and see.
Thank you.
A number of years ago when because I lived where I lived for quite a long time, they used to come by and cut the trees and clean the creek out every year or two. And they haven't done that in years, and that I think has contributed to our flooding problem. Because for years they would come along every 2 years and clean that ditch out so that the water could flow properly.
And I don't want to speak for transportation. Some of that becomes environmental issues. We did get in a little bit of hot water with Corps of Engineers and some other folks for doing some of that in other areas of town, I know. You know, we want to do as much as we can within the environmental regulations that are out there. And I just don't have the answer to that question as I sit here. So
and also one of the things, because we get a lot of people calling the state about things such as that, as much as there are more enforcement, more regulations, more agencies involved, that they are not afraid to fine local communities or to put injunctions against local communities. And at the same time, we were talking about the increased flooding that's occurring. So sometimes you're so busy reacting to the immediate need that it's difficult to get to the more long-term maintenance needs also. It's not an excuse, it's just the reality of what we're seeing across the state, you know, trying to deal with that. And that brings us to things such as community mitigation. You brought up some good options that you were talking about, some questions that could go into possibly a scoping project, where you're looking at it and you're finding out what is the feasibility. And feasibility, in the best of all worlds, we would just look at reducing volume and timing and velocity of the water. But we have multiple landowners, we have multiple regulations that it can take a while. I'll give you an example. City of Maumelle is doing a community drainage project, a large community drainage project. And they have been working on it for 4 years. And the 4 years, they haven't put a shovel in the ground yet because they have been working so diligently with the homeowners and the landowners to get the easements, to do a great job of designing a facility that will solve the problems. And so they are moving ahead, doing this great job, but it is a long process, unfortunately, because there are these multiple entities involved. So, but they're doing a great, like I said, City of Maumelle is doing a really good job, and they're posed to build their facility, but it's, you know, they had to invest the time and the hard work. Community mitigation. So that is an example, Maumelle's community mitigation. Another one, you could do the, you could scope it, or you're ready once you've scoped it to actually create something, to actually dig the pond, dig the facility, to do stream bank restoration, to expand it, to do wetland restoration, things such as that. Next. So I said that I'm talking about the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. There are two other programs that also provide money for flood mitigation. And it is the, we'll start with BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. All right, they have the same timing we have. They generally pay for the exact same type of projects. The big difference between the two programs, to be in my program, we have to have a high flood insurance policy participation. And their program, you don't need that. That means there's different things on the valuation of your home, what is counted, what isn't counted as a duplication of benefits and things such as that. But for the most part, they're the same type of program. I'm working with the State Hazard Mitigation Officer, Lacey Blake, and we are coming up with a universal initial application form so that when communities apply, that they are automatically being considered by both my program and her program, so they're not duplicating their effort. Another program that's available is the HMGP program, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. That program, the good thing about it, it doesn't have timelines. As long as they have money, you can apply. They do many of the things that the other programs. The challenging thing is the funding depends on having a federally declared disaster. The HMGP funding that's available is dependent on having a disaster that has been recognized by the president, and that there's a percentage of those damages that are made available for mitigation. And it's not just, and for their program, it's not just flooding mitigation, it's also tornadoes, wildfires, mudslides, things such as that. But we are working together. Those two programs are administered by the Arkansas Division of Emergency Management. Next. So this is kind of confusing maybe, but we'll talk about it. So this is what we think. This is how it goes. You are here because you are experiencing an issue and you want it solved. So you're bringing this issue to us. You're bringing this issue to Alan. You're bringing it to the state. So you're taking that information and you're bringing it and saying, hey, we have an issue. You know, we'd like to see if there are possible options available through that program. Alan's going to work with the communities to see what, given the restrictions of the various options are there, you know, what might work, what would be feasible. And then the community, the city of Fayetteville, will make an application. They will be a sub-applicant. They make the application on behalf of the community, and that application will come to me, the state. We are considered the applicant because we will submit the final application to FEMA. So we receive the applications, we review them, we look at them in terms of benefit cost analysis, feasibility, how well do they match with FEMA's current priorities, funding priorities, likelihood of them being funded. You know, we work with the community to make the strongest proposal possible. And we rank them according to the state priorities also. Once that is done, we forward those to FEMA. And FEMA is not looking at it just for Arkansas. They're looking at it for all of the communities across the United States and the territories. They are looking at all of those, and they are going to select the ones that match their priorities best, that have the best BCAs, and that they believe will address, in my opinion, this time around, their two major goals, which is resiliency and equity. So they're looking for resilience. It's not just fixing the immediate problem, but it will provide protection for future problems. Resilience and equity. Are the people that are being served, are they from a historically disadvantaged community? Are they in a neighborhood that has a large percentage of low or moderate income residents? So those are things that FEMA will most likely be looking at. Next. For my program, like I said, we're looking at people who have a policy, an NFIP policy. If you don't have a flood insurance policy, I'm going to encourage you to get one, okay? Anyone can get a policy. You can live in the desert on a mountain, as long as it's in the US or in the territory, and get a NFIP policy. I like NFIP policies because it's not a credit check. They're not going to immediately go up because you make a claim. They're not going to mysteriously disappear because it's raining. It's transferable to the next. It's a good selling point. We get people calling all the time. You know, can I take their policy over? Yes, you can take it over, you know, and it opens up the mitigation possibilities. If you are an NFIP policyholder and you're entering this program and you're applying for a grant, so not only are you eligible for my program, you're still eligible for the other two programs too. So it opens up the possibilities, increases your likelihood. Or it could be that the neighborhood has a high percentage of policy owners, particularly when we're looking at something that will be a community type of project. And finally, the community has to have a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan, which I'm sure you are going to have. You're going to have before the application period. And Washington County, so Fayetteville is part of Washington County's hazard mitigation plan, and they're finalizing it. And they should have it available in time. Next. So let's talk about the cycle, because this is the reality of it. I stand here and I talk about it and people are like, yes, sounds great. It does. It does. But you still have to be patient. Okay? The NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunity, should be posted in August of this year. When that comes out from FEMA, we'll have an idea of how much money is available nationwide, and we'll also have a better idea of what their funding priorities are this year. We will start accepting applications from local communities beginning in September. We will work with communities to strengthen their proposals as much as possible so that when it goes up all the way up the chain, all the way to the federal level, it is a very strong proposal that garners the support and interest that we would like to see. In February of next year through May, FEMA will be reviewing these proposals in conjunction with the state. So there may be requests for additional information. One thing that we've seen a lot in Northwest Arkansas, there's requests for review for historic and environmental impacts. It doesn't throw it out. They just want to know, they want to see the consideration, and if there are historic impacts or if there are environmental impacts, then that is built into the project. How do you address those? Selections from FEMA. Optimistically, June of next year. So we're talking a year from now, okay? But remember, the proposals didn't go in until January. And so in June, maybe as late as September though, okay? But once you're selected, the money is available to start on the project, all right? Most of the projects have 36 months to be deployed from the time of award. And if necessary, we can apply for a period of performance extension, a POP extension. Big, large-scale projects such as retention detention facilities, stream bank restorations, they have a 48-month period of performance. Next. Now, so it's time, all right, and it's money. So most of these, whether they be BRIC, HMGP, or my program, FMA, they're funded at 25-75. 75% of the acquisition cost, 75% of the elevation cost, 75% of the community mitigation cost is provided by FEMA. 25% has to come from somewhere else. Next. Like I said, FEMA funding for 75% and 25%, it has to be non-federal. So you can't match it with another federal grant. Next. So that can be community cash. It can be community in kind. In Shannon Hills, they're doing acquisition and demolition, and the Department of Public Works is doing some of the demolition activity. What we see most often is property owner contribution, where the property owner is contributing the cost share. So that is something to keep in mind. But there are instances where that cost share does drop. If you're in the BRIC program, the program that's run by Adam, FEMA will pay up to 90% if it's a small, impoverished community. They're not going to say that Fayetteville is a small and impoverished community, all right? Now, through FMA, they'll pay up to 90% of the cost for repetitive loss structures. To be a repetitive loss structure, that's a declaration through the NFIP. You have an NFIP policy and you have been declared a repetitive loss structure, 90%. And FEMA will pay up to 100% for severe repetitive loss. So that's the cost of repairs over and over again is even more significant than a repetitive loss structure, and that's 100%. We are hoping that there might be similar discounts available in this upcoming cycle for those properties that are owned or impacted, owned by low or moderate income homeowners, property owners. We have seen it in some of the other communities for other projects, and we're hoping that FEMA will extend that type of discount, but we can't guarantee it. So I normally tell people, expect a 25% cost share, and let's see what we can get, all right? Next. So you were asking about valuation. Post-event valuation, you would have to have had what's considered a FEMA flood, an NFIP flood. A FEMA NFIP flood is not, it's just, I had some water in my yard. It's either that the water covered 2 or more acres, or it impacted 2 or more properties. So it could just be your property and your neighbor, but it's also in the street, and the street's owned by the municipality, so then there's 2 or more properties. So if we were doing post-event valuation, that would be the type of flood we're looking at. Next. So these are examples. This would be an NFIP flood. That would be an NFIP flood. And that, of course, would be an NFIP flood. So I want to just stress again, if you don't have flood insurance, please think about it. More than 20% of all floods occur outside the floodplain. One of the things I hear all the time is my insurance agent told me I can't get it or I don't need it. Or I hear real estate agents say that also. Get it. Particularly if you're outside the floodplain, then you can get as much or as little as you want. If you're repetitively experiencing $10,000 worth of damage, you can get a policy. If you're outside the floodplain, you don't have a mortgage, or it doesn't matter actually if you have a mortgage or not, you're outside the floodplain, you can buy flood insurance for $10,000. You can buy flood insurance for your contents if you're a renter. Any of these things, please think about it. During the 2019 flood, which I know you weren't impacted by that, but just to give you an example, during the 2019 flood, the average NFIP policy claim was $75,000. The average amount that people who didn't have the NFIP policy received was less than $10,000. And most of that was immediate aid to rent a hotel room, to get some food, and it was a low-cost loan from the SBA that they had to pay back. Who do you think recovered quicker? The people who had the $75,000 payout from their flood insurance, or the $10,000 mostly loan? So those are, I'm just encouraging you, whether you're ever in my program, it's a very good thing to have. Next. So I'm with Montague. I'm with the Dam Safety Floodplain Management Group. I do have cards here. If you have any questions, are there any questions online? If you have any questions, if you need additional information, please make sure you take one of my cards, and I'll be happy to speak with you. Yes?
It's obvious that these programs are not here for existing structures.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything within the funding of these programs that could be used to incentivize more resilient development for new projects or rehabilitation?
We would have to see what came out of the NOFO. Historically, that has not been there. Yes?
What are your thoughts on someone building something in the flood? I mean, I don't think it's a good idea. So we have a neighbor who has applied for a rezoning variance so they can build 3 houses where there's 1 house. I just don't think it's a good idea.
So,
I mean, we'll see what happens on Monday.
okay, thank you.
So I'll speak to it from a city of Fayetteville standpoint as best I can. So we talked about our ordinance modifications that happened in the middle of last year. Those modifications and city council, I think, was instrumental in directing this. We do not desire to see our floodplains en masse filled in or developed, and there's a lot of reasons for that. The main reason being it negatively impacts our streams, it negatively impacts our adjacent residents. So they took active steps to say, if you're going to build in the floodplain, you have to do what's called a no adverse impact analysis. What that means is, it's fancy terminology for, we do the engineering analysis to make sure whatever you're doing doesn't increase the base flood elevations, it doesn't increase stream velocities, it doesn't increase your flows in your streams. And if I won't say it'll never happen in Fayetteville, because there's certainly instances where we've had them be able to show that, but it won't happen indiscriminately, somewhat like it has in the past. The only previous regulation was FEMA does not allow you to fill in the floodway, but you could fill in developed floodplains, and I don't disagree with you. We were seeing some pretty negative impacts from that. So,
What he said. So, but I mean, obviously, I discourage going, increasing development in the floodplain. But if you do it smart and do it in conjunction with the regulations. Mm-hmm. So all of the programs, so over the last 2 years, FEMA has had a big push on resilience and equity. How that is codified in their grant programs is yet to be seen, because they have not released grants since this big push has occurred, okay? But we are anticipating, we are not sure, we're not promising, but we're anticipating that there will be some credit, some benefit for incorporating resilience, incorporating equity into your proposal. Yes.
For those property owners
Mm-hmm.
that they are not technically minded, they don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily know much about flood disease
Mhm.
Where can they turn to talk to someone about the flood mitigation kind of procedures or options that they could use for this funding? Where can they talk to somebody to get an idea of what they're actually going to fund the money for?
Well, I'm going to turn this over to you in one moment. The community is the applicant, because when it's all said and done, they're on the line for the cost share. They're on the line for maintenance of any open space. They're on the line for making sure that things are implemented as approved. Because if it's not, FEMA can come back and say, no, that's not what we agreed to. You're gonna have to pay us back or make it right at your own cost. So it is the community that applies. So the purpose of this, and Alan may have different, and I'll have him expand, is to tell you that there are opportunities and to start that conversation between you and Alan and see, what does the community have the appetite for, the ability to put forth, and you want to make sure that you're putting something together that has that high BCA, that resiliency, that equity. Those are almost guaranteed to be stronger than other projects. We're competing on a national level, and 160 million sounds like a lot, but it's really not when you divide it across the entire nation and you think about what's been happening with the rainfall and the precipitation events.
So I guess maybe I should be asking Alan, I believe it was you mentioned that you're pushing in her door, and can I build a boundary in front of it? Like, she needs somebody who can help her engineer a solution, but she doesn't have a technical background, so, where should she turn?
She can certainly call me, and we can have those conversations. I would like to expand on two things that Whit said. Number one, although it may sound like August, September is a long way away, as I sit here having trying to put some of this together, it's pretty quick. This, I would like to remind everyone that this funding is annual, barring any unforeseen circumstances. So if something happens, we can't get everyone on the same page, we can't get everything put together this year, certainly that opportunity is available for us next year as well. So I think this is just the initial conversation about what issue is this neighborhood specifically facing and how do we attack that. No.
You had 2 minutes.
No, go ahead.
Well, can you speak to how the community applications will be prioritized in that way? For example, this is Valley, Weddington.
I can tell you we are targeting this area from a staff standpoint for our initial application. And that's not to say it's going to only be this area, but when we had our 2017 event, council asked us to do some rankings, and I think you and I have spoken about this, but the Valley Drive West End area ranked out very highly as far as being negatively impacted from flooding. That prompted us to do a flood study to determine, are there engineered solutions? Unfortunately, we weren't finding a lot of feasible engineered solutions, or any for that matter. That prompted us to go to the other options. What other options do we have to mitigate your properties so you don't get water inside the home? That was one of council's biggest tasks for staff, was we want to reduce flooding inside structures. These options are available for that. So I think the next steps moving forward are going to be reaching out to individual property owners, maybe doing some additional education, maybe having a conversation about, are you interested in participating? This would not be any sort of eminent domain type situation. It's going to be a voluntary program. So we're not going to force people out of their homes. We're going to say, do you want to participate? And if you want to participate, at what level do you want to participate? And help us to put together an application of willing participants in the community, so that we could request this money from FEMA. So that's how I see it going. We're not here to push you or anyone in any one direction, but we do desire to put together an attractive application to FEMA so that we could address this neighborhood as a whole.
Go going back to when we were talking about the technical review period, what we have seen in the past is sometimes a community will put together, let's say for whatever reason, Fayetteville decides everyone who walks in the door, we're going to put them in the application. FEMA is may say, I think it's really important that Fayetteville reduces things, but we don't see the BCA here, and they will cherry pick out properties. So,
And I
you
think,
know, and the longer you're going back and forth, the longer before the money's released, because they're not going to release that money until everybody's on the same page.
and I would say from strictly a city administration standpoint, staff time, I don't anticipate we're going to have the ability to begin to address multiple flood loss areas in the same application or different applications at the same time. I just don't think we have the administrative ability to do that. So I would anticipate if we move forward with some sort of application, it could potentially be for the Valley Drive area, and then maybe next year or the following year we pick another repetitive loss area and we go that direction. But the hierarchy, if you will, comes directly from the ranking that City Council asked us to put together. There are two main areas that came to the top of that hierarchy. The other one, we did do a flood study for it. Full disclosure, it's out on Salem Drive. There's a neighborhood out there that floods relatively routinely, similar to this area. We were able to document some potential engineered solutions that would help them with some flood walls and some increasing of bridge sizing and things like that. But obviously that's going to come at a great cost. So we haven't pursued finalizing any designs at this point or funding opportunities, but that's certainly going to be a conversation we're going to have in the future.
And FEMA is going to take into account that, you know, what is the history of a community with this program? They want to set the community up for success. And it is an annual program. You know, the money will be there, barring anything extremely weird. You know, it was there during COVID every year. So, you know, it's going to be there. They want to see that it's understandable. It's a FEMA program. It has its own way of doing things. And so having that community, because it's not just the application, the community is responsible for the administrative part of it too. The state does not administer the local programs. Those are administered by the community. So there's that additional concern too. And there are some communities that are in our program today that put forth the same application 3 or 4 times before they were accepted by FEMA, because it took that long to really come up with a really strong program where they could really show the benefit to the community. Because remember, you're selling it on a national level to other communities. So, to national.
Would it be your preference to have most people elevate or be willing to sell? I mean, is there some formula for that on you know, hey, we got half would sell and half would elevate, you could do that, or?
I think ultimately it may come back to the benefit cost analysis too. You know, how strong is that benefit cost analysis when we submit it to FEMA? I'll tell you, there are no kind of preconceived notions from the city of Fayetteville. I think there's advantages and disadvantages to both options. Certainly the advantage to elevation is people get to stay in their homes. They get to keep their homes without the threat of water entering the house every time we have one of these events, and they're not looking to relocate or find different properties in a very tight housing market that we're in right now. So, you know, from the standpoint of buyout, you know, you have the advantage of you know, open space. We return those floodplains to what they were naturally designed to do, and that's house that water. And you also, with elevation, you could potentially still have risks of flooding of vehicles and things like that. So you do have some damage exposure there. It's just hopefully not inside the structure. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I think we will work through that with some of the benefit cost analysis and some desires from the property owners in the region. We don't, like I said, we don't have a preconceived notion on the way this wants to go or needs to go. I think the next steps, just so I don't forget, just housekeeping items, and it's not over, so please continue to ask questions. But if you've not signed the sign-in sheet, please do so. So that gives us an ability to contact you and keep you up to date with what we're doing. And then beyond that, I anticipate that as a staff, we're going to be contacting people either individually or as a small community, I don't know yet, to continue the conversation of knowing what we know now. Would you be interested in the program, and what portion of that program would you be interested in?
Yeah. So you could say you're interested in both, like I would be interested in your elevation, because I would, you want to do whatever is in the best interest of the entire group. So,
Sure.
Would that be an option?
Absolutely, I think so, and we could make sure that we just keep you in the loop with the next steps. Hey, I'm interested in, this is my address, I'm interested in elevating my home, so I reduce my risk of flooding. We can begin to build an application off of that.
But you anticipate contacting individual property owners in this
Correct.
area?
I believe that would be our next steps. Yes, ma'am.
How do we know if elevation is an option?
Certainly, it's an option within the program.
I mean, for our particular town, if it's a possibility.
The way that we're looking at it from a staff, and I believe that FEMA will ultimately look at it, is I hate to say it, but it's sometimes follow the money. So they look at repetitive and severe repetitive loss structures for a reason. That's because it's costing their program money every time they pay out a policy. So I think it unfortunately will strengthen our application if we have those in the Valley Drive area, and it's protected by Privacy Act. So don't even ask me which ones they are. We do have several repetitive loss structures, but we are not able to disclose which ones. I think that will bolster, and Whit, you correct me if I'm wrong, will somewhat bolster our application. So it really depends on the individual structure or the makeup of the structures, where they're located, et cetera, on kind of what we think is going to be attractive to FEMA in that ultimate grant application. So I think to answer your question, from a logistics standpoint, it's easier to elevate homes that are on crawl spaces just because you can get under them more readily and you can support those and lift them up. I think the vast majority of the structures that we have on Valley Drive are on a crawl space, so they would be, I think, logistically eligible for that type of assistance. It then becomes a question of what does that homeowner's desire, and then what does that benefit cost analysis look like when we submit it to FEMA? Yes, sir.
How I understood you say that if you qualify as a city for any of these programs, it hinges on the county's flood mitigation plan being approved by FEMA?
It's their hazard mitigation plan, but yes, it has to be approved.
And where is that at?
The Washington County Emergency Management houses that. In 2015, they updated that, and we as a city adopted their plan as our plan. I think it has since expired. They're working feverishly to get that reapproved.
Right.
But yes, that would have to be in place to make us eligible to apply, which is another factor that we really don't have a lot of control over as far as getting an application in this year. But certainly we're working with them in that direction. Any other questions? And again, I'm here till at least 7:30. So if you've got questions and would like to stay and chat offline, that's fine too. But I would remind you two things. Make sure you signed in. I've got a stack of business cards up here as well. If you would like my contact information as far as email, phone number, and all of that, please take one with you. Feel free to, email is generally the easiest way to get a hold of me, but feel free to email or call with questions or comments. Hey, we're interested in the program, make sure we're on the list, however you feel like you would like to proceed. So. Good deal.
Thank you.
I appreciate Whit's time. She's got some cards up here as well. Thank you everybody for coming out. Thank you those that were able to join on Zoom, and we look forward for some future conversations.